You're listening to the Scotiabank Market Points podcast. I'm your host, Greg White. Market Points is part of the Knowledge Capital series, a collection of audio, video, and written commentary from Scotiabank global banking and markets leaders designed to provide you with timely insights and analysis. Joe Biden was introduced as the president-elect of the United States this past weekend after major media outlets, as is customary, called the election in his favor. Unsurprisingly, President Trump has failed to concede to date and has continued to push his team to pursue legal action in the hopes of overturning the results, with the general consensus that these efforts will be in vain. The markets agreed, pushing forward as a Biden presidency became more likely. And then on Monday morning, they moved strongly on the news that Pfizer is showing promising results for its COVID-19 vaccine. On this episode of Market Points, Scotiabank Senior Vice President and Chief Economist Jean-François Perrault joins us to discuss his perspective on the economic impacts of a Biden administration. Hi, Jean-François. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Greg. Pleasure to be here.
So, lots of big news over the weekend. Joe Biden, the presumptive president-elect, and then just this morning, Pfizer coming out and announcing that it looks like they've got positive results for a vaccine. And these two things put together happening, both of them quite global in scope. What is the impact, I guess from the Canadian perspective, with this new potential Biden presidency and, of course, the solution for the virus?
Well, you're talking about multi-layered impacts, right? On the face of it, a Biden victory is positive in the sense that it reduces uncertainty. So one of the key hallmarks, if you will, of the Trump presidency has been to create a tremendous amount of uncertainty in economic policy making, and in particular on trade policy. And of course, that's mattered tremendously for Canada, right? I mean, the U.S. is by far our largest trading partner, and we've had challenges with the Trump administration. There's no denying that. You know, steel and aluminum tariffs, we consider national security risk, and that is almost certainly to go away under Biden. So, from an immediate perspective, there's this kind of likely benefit of more normal trading relationships with the U.S. From a Canadian perspective, but more broadly, we're also likely to see a little bit of that at the global level. So a much more constructive approach, much more collaborative approach than the Trump administration has chosen to pursue, and that has the potential again to lower kind of global uncertainty and probably raise to some extent, trade flows and investment flows across a range of countries. So that has the potential to be positive. There's no denying that. And of course, when you layer in on top of that, the fact that President-elect Biden had a platform of, pretty aggressive platform in terms of various types of things that he wanted to achieve, whether it's on the economic front, the climate change front, the social front. Just focusing on his economic platform, if he's able to achieve some of what he wants to achieve, you're looking at probably a substantially stronger U.S. economy in the short run, assuming the Republicans allow him to go down that path, which is a big assumption, probably unlikely. And of course, if the U.S. Does things to elevate itself, again, we are so tight linked to them that it necessarily means that Canada is better in that world. Now, of course, this is all occurring. There was uncertainty about whether or not there still is a bit of uncertainty as to whether or not President-elect Biden becomes president. I mean, the Trump administration is fighting that pretty aggressively in the courts, so we'll see. But this is occurring in an environment where, for instance, in the U.S. and in Europe, and to a lesser degree in Canada, COVID is exploding. 125,000 cases a day in the U.S. It's on a pretty strong upward path, so it's likely to increase as we go forward. That's a key economic challenge facing the U.S. economy and therefore the global economy, and of course Canada in that context. So the news today that Pfizer's got a vaccine that seems to be, quite effective in terms of protecting individuals from the virus is fantastically positive. And we've seen, we've seen so far this morning a pretty positive reaction from markets. We'll see how long that lasts. But that has a potential to be as significant, if you will, a driver of economic recovery than the Biden platform or his ability or inability to move that. I mean, as I said, the reality is that um, viruses is a clear and present danger to the lives and livelihoods of Canadians, Americans, Europeans, and any indication that we are nearing a medical solution or medical alternative to dealing with the virus as opposed to shutting things down has a potential, I think, to significantly alter sentiment. Whether or not the vaccine is widely available until the middle of next year, end of next year, is somewhat irrelevant in that context. So from a Canadian perspective, generally speaking, the last 3 4 days have been pretty good, if we can stay on the right track.
I think that the comment about the timing of when may be a vaccine may be publicly available is an important one, especially if it goes out for a year, and then maybe if Biden has this ability to, in sort of lead the country, have individuals across America wearing masks, for instance,
Hmm.
makes it easier to keep the economy open. If people see the light at the end of the tunnel, maybe they're more willing to do it because they see it as a temporary measure. But still, I guess in the short term, there is a potential still dealing with this through 2021.
Yeah, there's no question. Like, this is going to get a lot worse, right? I mean, I don't want to be overly pessimistic here, but all you need to do is look at the trends in the U.S., and it's very, very clear that the picture painted by the virus, which, as you know, is up to a couple of weeks old, depending on how the testing goes, is pretty worrisome. And a vaccine is not going to change that in the short run. A vaccine obviously, leads us to be much more optimistic about, sometime later in 2021 and 2022. But like, they are dealing with a very, very, very substantial public health issue. Now, President Biden, I think, has made it, or President-elect Biden, I should say, has made it very clear that he is going to be dealing with this in a very different fashion than President Trump. So leading by example. But again, the reality in the U.S., which is a little bit different than other countries, is that the federal government has relatively little ability, other than leading by example, to influence public health decisions taken by states and local governments. So, as you've indicated, we're probably going to be in a world of, and despite this awesome news on the vaccine side, some pretty scary news on the virus side as it progresses through the U.S. for a few weeks, if not a few months still.
If we look a little bit longer term, then, and let's assume we can see past the coronavirus here, what will that mean for U.S. immigration once global movement of people gets back to normal? And I guess I'm specifically thinking about the Canadian perspective. I feel that over the last 4 years, individuals that may have looked to move elsewhere have kind of not considered the United States, and Canada has been the beneficiary of that. Now that we have Biden entering the White House, does that mean highly skilled immigrants from around the world are going to start considering the United States again? And that might have a negative impact on Canadian labor.
I mean, of course, there's that possibility. We have in Canada benefited tremendously from immigration over the last 3 4 years. It's been an extremely powerful driver of growth. I mean, we've coined the term human stimulus to Scotiabank to describe the positive effects of immigration. And there's also no question that we've benefited from, the Americans essentially pulling themselves out of the global immigration market. Um, and that's, it's hurt. We would argue it's hurt the Americans and benefited us in some extent. But the reality is that question hinges on, it hinges on the nature of the damage that the Trump administration has um, caused on, say, America's reputation as, a diverse and accepting society of immigrants. Historically, that has actually absolutely been the case in the U.S. Trump has clearly shaken things up there. But it also begs the question of, how what are the lasting impacts of Trumpism? I mean, the reality, as you well know, is Trump got almost 50% of the vote. So there are roughly 50% of Americans who still buy into the main elements of Trump's way of thinking. And of course, one of those elements is, some hesitancy to accept immigrants, certainly to the extent that the U.S. historically has. So, I think it's going to take a little bit of time in order for, um, Biden and the U.S. to prove that they are going back to, the acceptance of immigrants that they historically have had. I don't know that folks are going to necessarily want to accept that right off the bat, given the fact that, as I said, there still are close to the majority of Americans, close to half of Americans who probably, um, still have some pretty strong views, negative views on immigration.
How do you think the impact will be with respect to a Biden presidency? I guess both from an immigration standpoint, but also maybe more importantly, an economic one for Latin America from their domestic perspective.
Mhm. Well, you know, I mean, the very simple way to think about it is a strong U.S. means, generally speaking, means a strong global economy, and of course, those countries that are most closely associated with the U.S. are stronger than others. And that's certainly true for Canada. It's absolutely true for Mexico, and it's true for a large number of Latin American economies. It's also true indirectly in the sense that, again, depending on what Biden manages to achieve, some key elements of his platform involved a fairly aggressive infrastructure plan, pretty significant spending on the U.S. economy, and that has a potential, obviously, to raise international commodity prices. I mean, we've seen oil prices trend up a little bit over the last couple of weeks in anticipation of a Biden presidency. Obviously, we're seeing that spike even more just this morning because of the vaccine. But the global environment should be one in which commodity prices are generally higher under Biden presidency, and that in and of itself is unambiguously positive for Latin America and for other commodity producing countries. At the same time, again, we do have I think that one of the characteristics of a Biden administration relative to Trump administration is going to be greater respect, I think, or for the rules of the game, right? So you sign a deal with a country, and you don't renege on it shortly afterwards, or you don't add various things that weren't part of the deal, which has been a hallmark of the Trump approach to trade. So to the extent that we also go back to a world where there's more normalcy in trading relationships, that agreements are, collaboratively implemented, that there isn't a sense or worry that you might run afoul of the president in one week and then find yourself subject of sanctions and subject of restrictions on your ability to do things. Again, that all speaks very, very well to the global economy, and of course, particularly Latin America, given how integrated we all are. You know, I guess we're including Canada in that with the U.S. So it's pretty hard to see how this isn't unambiguously positive for Latin America as well.
Sticking with the theme then of fair play in global trade, how do you think things are going to play out with U.S. China relations?
So this is going to be a trickier one. So one of the focuses of the Trump administration had been to rebalance trade with China, but it did so in basically by pushing other commercial trading partners away. So it was basically the U.S. versus China. Whereas previous governments in the US, both Republican and Democratic, had sought to build coalitions to try and influence Chinese trade policy and influence Chinese policies. That's likely to be how the Biden administration approaches it, right? That there is greater strength in confronting China and getting China to play by kind of the international rules of the game on the trading side and on the protection of intellectual property and a range of things, if you have a broad coalition of countries arguing for the same thing rather than the American approach, which has been, we're going to try and get these things out of the Chinese, and we don't care what the Europeans or the Canadians or other countries think about this. One of the first things President Trump did when he took power was to walk away from the CTPP, so this trade agreement, this Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, that had been designed in part to force China to play by the rules of the game in the Asia Pacific economies. And as I said, the Trump administration walked away from that right away. So we do think at the end of the day there will be a more impactful influence, or an ability to have a more impactful influence on Chinese policy with the Biden administration and the coalition that they will build. And that ultimately, I think, will improve on a sustainable basis the relationship between China and the US and the rest of the world. And again, hopefully benefit the global economy. Because as you know, one of the key uncertainties of the Trump administration or the Trump period had been this ongoing fear that the China-U.S. trade conflict would get out of hand, and represented this constant downside risk to the global recovery and global expansion. I think it's likely to be the case that those risks are significantly lowered in with the Biden administration.
Do you think a Biden administration sort of gets to play good cop, bad cop here, where they leave some of the protectionist measures in place, at least temporarily, as a bargaining chip? And is this a way that the Biden administration could work with, let's say, Republicans in Congress?
I think so. That in a way you can think of that as one of the gifts of Trump's legacy, that he's put in place a range of protectionist policies that can be used as bargaining chips to achieve various outcomes, either with respect to China or other countries as well. And Democrats historically have been more protectionist than Republicans have, right? Like Trump's perspective on trade is very much at odds with the historical Republican perspective on trade, much more closely aligned to the Democratic perspective on trade. Um, Now, the Democratic perspective on change is changing as a result of Trump, because they can't be seen to be thinking the same thing. But I do think there is an opportunity here to unwind some of these things in a way that ultimately will lead to better trade outcomes around the world. Or certainly more certainty on the trade policy side, which is critical.
It's an interesting point about that sort of flip flopping of what appears on a given U.S. party's political platform. One of the things that's constantly on the Republican side is a pushback against progressive sort of
Mhm.
social um, action. And you had mentioned earlier about the 70 million plus votes that Trump got. I would imagine that a good portion of that is probably individuals that may not support the man, but are just so against, let's say, this quote unquote socialism that's coming from the left. That's the line they voted on. Um, do you actually foresee more progressive policy getting pushed forward in the next 4 years? And if so, might that mean for the U.S. economy?
So there's an interesting electoral result in the U.S. in Florida, which speaks to this question to some extent. So you had, the Republicans are, the party of the free market, non-intervention, laissez-faire economics, and all that supply side economics, and all this kind of stuff. The in Florida, which obviously chose to reelect President Trump, and to I guess, and that obviously not going to happen. But there was a referendum put in place in Florida as well, which sought to increase the minimum wage very significantly, from $8 something to $15, and that passed with overwhelming majority. So it's this very sharp contrast between Floridians voting for the man and what he represents, for social reasons, religious reasons, ethnic reasons, whatever it might be. Yet uh, were voted for really quite progressive labor market policies. So I think that speaks to some of the changes that are going on in the U.S. with respect to income inequality, the tensions that were laid bare by COVID, and the kind of the displaced workers and folks that were particularly harmed. Obviously, the challenge that the Republicans and Democrats have had over the last few weeks to agree to a stimulus package to help workers and help independent firms. I think we're seeing the beginning of a bit of a greater openness to more progressive economic ideas being rolled out by the next administration. in contrast to I think much more firmly held views on along the social dimension, right? And I think that does provide a bit of openness for the Biden administration to move forward on things that would not have been considered likely 6 months ago, 8 months ago. Um, for instance, minimum wage and active labor market policies and those kinds of things. Um, but that, his ability to do anything substantial on that front will ultimately be determined by what the Senate decides to allow him to do. And it could very well be that we are in the space where the Senate will run, a pretty hard defense against a Biden administration and prevent a lot of the more progressive aspects of his economic policies and social policies, just given the Republican dogma, even if it contrasts to some extent with um, the kind of the revealed preference of some U.S. voters in a place like Florida.
Big part of that progressive agenda has been the Green New Deal. What does a Biden presidency mean for the green economy globally?
It's likely to be a catalyst for some change. Now, the president, through executive action, has an ability to um, have a pretty significant impact on the regulatory environment in the U.S. So we expect him to, um, roll back a lot of the Trump initiatives on methane and on drilling on federal lands and those kinds of things. But again, to undertake real substantive change, change laws, put in place incentive structures to transition from one kind of type of energy to another, it requires legislative approval, and that is going to be difficult. But without any question, though, we are going to be seeing a uh, much more positive conversation coming out of the administration with respect to green technologies, green environment, uh, climate change than we've seen in certainly the last 4 years, and maybe even beyond that. So it's not likely to be the game changer that there was an expectation of, given the fact that the Senate remains Republican. But I absolutely anticipate that we will have um, almost certainly much more, green finance, green action in a Biden administration, with of course implications for the rest of the world than would have been the case otherwise.
That was Jean-François Perrault, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at Scotiabank. You can now find Scotiabank's Market Points on Apple Podcasts. Don't miss an opportunity to hear from industry thought leaders. Click subscribe. And if you've been enjoying Market Points, please be sure to rate and review us. You can also find more thought-leading content from Scotiabank on our website at gbm.scotiabank.com. And you can also follow us on Twitter at ScotiabankGBM, as well as our LinkedIn Showcase page under Scotiabank Global Banking and Markets. Please refer to our legal disclosures on our website. I'm Greg White, and thanks for listening.